My first question would be, who is Tristan Jackson, and how did you get interested in iOS development?
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for having me. How did I get started? I was really into computers as a kid. Um, my first computer was an IBM 286. Um, so I was pretty good getting around navigating with the DOS prompt and all that. And I wrote like simple batch files and stuff like that, like simple, batch programming. I learned a little C++. Um, but in high school, I became more interested in stuff like English, and I had a really good English teacher. And in college, I studied philosophy. And one point I wanted to be a writer. Some point I settled on something more practical as being a lawyer. So after college, I was uh, I was working for my mother. She was an architect in Chicago downtown. It was her own little architecture firm, and while working for her, I was like studying for the LSAT, the test you take to, go to law school. But her health was like suddenly declining, and she was in her 50s, and wasn't, it, we went to a lot of doctors, but they didn't know what it was. And suddenly I found myself like, more and more sort of wrapped up both in like helping her at work, and helping her at home. Um, it turned out to be ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. She, but we didn't find that out till like, I don't know, a few months before she passed away.
I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, it's a sad story. But coming out of that, I knew I didn't want to do what I was doing before. I knew I didn't want to do law. I didn't want to be a lawyer. But I didn't know what I wanted to be. So I started just trying programming again, like sort of like something to try. It's something I used to do as a kid. It's a practical thing. So I started with Python, building like basic web apps and stuff using Flask and stuff like that. I moved on to doing JavaScript, Ruby, lots of things. And then finally, I sort of stumbled upon Swift, and Swift was something that I found I immediately fell in love with both the language, and with the iOS development community and iOS development in general. And I liked it better than web. So prior to that, I thought I might do some kind of web development, like boot camp or something like that. But iOS was the thing I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do mobile. I liked making apps. Something feels different about a mobile app than your typical web app. And that's what got me into it.
Gotcha. And and so with you said you mentioned you liked the language. How is the language compared to like JavaScript? And getting to learn like all the syntax and the fundamentals. What did you like it over your previous languages?
Yeah. So JavaScript's cool, Python's cool. JavaScript's obviously very modern. Python is too. I like the syntax of Python. It's simple, like it's almost like pseudocode simple. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But
it kind of feels like in like 5 years you're gonna be writing actual sentences. That's how
yeah. Almost. It
incredible.
almost does feel like that.
Right.
And so I guess the static type system in Swift was something that, it's weird to say I'm into type safety or something like that, but it was something that I enjoyed. And I guess, maybe I could have fallen in love with all these other languages too, but
Right.
it was just something about writing Swift. Just I don't know, it clicked with me more than anything else. I don't think it's anything past that. It's weird to say it's just because it was. I know it's a very performant language, and I think part of it might have what attracted me was that like Swift is more performant than something like Python, which is typically run on the command line. You couldn't compile Python, but it's still never going to approach the performance of Swift. And I thought it was, I guess, because when I was a kid and I was like used to programming, like I didn't get far in C++. Don't get me wrong, but
Right.
like mm, something closer to C++, something closer to the those lower level languages to me was somewhat attractive rather than just running simple Python scripts, I guess.
Gotcha. And did you ever use like the Apple products?
Um,
Uh, yeah, just growing up, did you use like Apple products like iPhones or MacBooks or iPads?
yeah, so it's interesting because like around that time that I had fallen like out, I started moving a little bit away from tech. That
Mhm.
was when I really fell in love with Apple. So I was like someone who was like, I wasn't programming at this point, you know what I mean? But I was
Right.
like very, I was comfortable, very comfortable with computers. So like, um, I was frustrated with my Toshiba notebook, and I ended up like, it was because of the iPod. That's how I got into it. I remember because
Right.
I was an early adopter of MP3 players, and I
Okay,
had
nice.
my crazy Zen whatever thing. It was like shaped like a CD player. You know what I mean? And I
Right,
liked it a lot, but like it
right.
broke on me. And I tried iPod, and I liked it so much better than the Creative Zen
Gotcha.
that it made me interested in Apple products. So this is like the
Is
iPod
that
with
the
the
one by,
scroll wheel.
was that the one with the Microsoft? Is that?
No, no, no. I was using the Apple iPod. So
Okay,
oh no, yeah, and then that was the Creative Zen was the other company. Um,
okay,
I don't know if I don't think Creative's around anymore. I don't think they survived, but it
okay.
was a big player early on in the MP3 market. They were like
Gotcha.
huge.
I see.
Um, and so I love when I first used the iPod, I loved the simplicity. I loved the build quality.
Right.
Um, it made me interested in trying um, an Apple notebook. So when my Toshiba was starting to, you know, not work as much, I switched over to using a MacBook, and I've been in love with Apple ever since then. So like, this is
Right.
like, well, my first Apple notebook was a PowerBook. It was like the last of the PowerBook line, right
Okay.
before right before they switched to Intel.
Gotcha.
Ever since then, I've been using Apple products forever.
Right.
Mm, It
I
was
see.
only,
That
uh,
was like right around '05, '06.
yep,
Yeah.
05, '06. So
Right.
like, mm, yeah, that would have been, yeah.
Right. Oh wow, nice. And I think that's around the same time the first iPhone was introduced, like 2007.
Yeah, so it was short. It was shortly before the first. It was like a year or two before the first iPhone got announced.
Right.
Um, it was, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I
Yeah.
was just thinking about how like it was interesting for me because I wasn't using computers as deeply, but
Mhm.
I found that like compared to my experience on Windows, you know what I mean? I know what I'm doing on Windows and all that. I
Right.
had so many less crashes, so many less problems with malware and other things, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
just it was night and day for me. And I try to tell my wife, she never wants to listen when I'm talking about like love of Apple products sometimes, but like
Yeah.
it really was like light years ahead of PCs, I believe, at that point.
Right. Right. Yeah. It was so well polished and everything like looked really nice. you couldn't really tell what exactly it is, but once you use the product, you just feel that you're holding something premium compared to like other products. So super nice. Nice. And yeah, so you have, and so you've been building apps, you've been learning iOS development for a year now, would you say?
Yeah, about a year and a half.
And you have an app in the App Store?
Yeah,
Could you tell me about that?
yeah. I have an app called it's my first app in the App Store. It's called Chicago Tow Check. It helps Chicagoans find their towed vehicles. Um, it's basically it makes GET requests to Chicago Data API, and it gets back whatever. It gets back information about where the car got towed to. And there's like two different ways you can be towed in Chicago. You can either get towed to an auto pound, and there's a few of them, you know what I mean?
Right.
In that case, if you got towed to an auto pound, it gives you the location of the auto pound, the phone number for the auto pound, et cetera, et cetera. But you can also just be relocated. Like if you parked on a street where like whatever, snow, construction, for some reason they got to move your car, you can be relocated like, you know, a mile away or whatever, 6 blocks away, wherever they can put cars. And then it gives you it does forward geocoding to give you the location there.
So this helps you to find the location. And so what kind of challenges did you face and how did you overcome them?
Yeah. So so the first iteration of that app, I I was learning a lot about app development, I think at that point, you know what I mean? And I was happy with the results and everything. I guess one of the first challenges I had was when parsing JSON. There were things I was using Codable, but everything didn't just parse neatly and nicely as I thought it would. And you know, I thought I had everything right because I'm like, you know, it gives you snake case and I'm changing it into, you know, camel case or whatever. But
It's like coding keys.
yep, I started realizing certain things about the APIs I was using. Like one, just because there's a key, there might not be a value there. So you got to handle the absence of value sometimes.
Right.
They had two dynamically created keys. I never knew about or encountered dynamically created keys. So you have keys that were like, you don't know what the key will be in advance.
Okay. Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, that was weird.
How did you solve that?
I actually just sort of went around it because I didn't even
Okay.
need the information from the dynamically created keys, because the
Okay.
dynamically created keys were like, for whatever reason, it's like they give three formats for giving addresses, you know, for where a car was relocated, and one of them it uses dynamically created keys. I didn't need that information to do the forward geocoding, so like I ignore it, go around it.
Nice.
The last challenge was ISO 8601, which is a time standard for like representing times. Um, Codable supports ISO 8601. There's an ISO 8061, their support for it, but they were using a proprietary version or using a particular version of ISO 8601 that wasn't supported. So I had to learn about, you know, it basically at the end, it has 3 extra places for milliseconds.
Right.
So I learned a lot about one, ISO 8601 time standard, and then two, about like, you know, how do I parse these things that, you know, some of the things you get back that are unusual.
Gotcha. And did you use like Eric Swift for your asynchronous operations, or
Um,
did
um,
you just use Grand Central Dispatch?
so yeah, I used GCD,
Okay.
and
Nice.
yeah, I used GCD.
And what about for your navigation? Did you use like coordinators for that? Okay, nice.
So yeah, that first version of toe check I made,
Yep.
it it wasn't it was I was proud of it, but like it wasn't sophisticated,
Yep.
like in terms of how did I create the thing. So I spent a good amount of time like looking at other people's apps, like production apps, you know what I mean? They're
Yep.
open source.
Nice.
And I changed my basic MVC design into a
Mhm.
MVVM.
Yeah.
And I used yeah, for the navigation I used the coordinator plant patterns. So like um
Yeah.
basically when you press a button, yeah, uh,
Yeah.
rather than it being just tied to the next view, you know what I mean? It goes to
Yeah.
its coordinator, asks, what is my next view? You know what I mean? The
Mhm.
coordinator takes care of that.
Wow. And you learned all these things by yourself, or did you have like a mentor guiding you throughout the steps? Or how's that?
Well, I didn't have a mentor like, like someone like, but like I also didn't do it alone is what I'd want to say is that like people in the Swift community, you know what I mean? That like Paul Hudson, the guys from Fireside Swift, others that like sort of put out those tutorials and stuff like that. You know what I mean? I learned
Yeah.
everything you can find. It's
Yeah.
there because of those people like them that make those contributions to the community. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
so I didn't do it in
Definitely see
alone
that.
in the sense that like I had resources. Then
Right.
I had their tutorials. I had their you know
Right. And also like Ray Randelick as well.
Yeah, I love Ray
Mm.
Wonderlick. I've
Right.
learned so much from their tutorials.
Right.
Yeah.
Nice. And yeah, so after you've released your app, that's when you started to looking for a iOS position.
Yeah.
And
So
yeah, yeah,
you go.
yeah. So could you tell me about that process, the interview process, and how it's been so far for you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so I think I started interviewing. I probably started interviewing earlier before I was even ready, you know what I mean, when I first started interviewing. Um, and I think there's pros and cons to that approach. It was advice I had read was like people say start applying before you think you're even ready, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Mm. But those early interviews, they were rougher, you know what I mean? Like it was there were a lot of things. And so I guess you have when you don't have a CS degree and you don't have like previous experience making iOS development besides your own individual projects, you really got to do a lot of hustling to get like a interview, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
um
All right.
so I the first big interview I did was with a small company. and i I did, let's see, I did a 30-minute phone screen with them, you know what I mean? The typical call you get. And
Right.
then I did a 45-minute like technical phone interview after that. It was just like less HR type questions, more like, you know, typical technical questions. And then
Right.
I did an 8-hour coding take home project with them.
Oh, okay. I
Yeah.
thought you were in
And
the office for 8 hours. I was like, whoa.
no, that would be amazing.
Okay.
Um, and then I did a 3-hour technical on-site with them,
Yeah.
and where you were doing like big O notation type problems. Um, they ended up not going with me, hiring me, and I be honest with you, because it was a small company and they could only hire one iOS developer. You know what I mean? They
Right.
ended. While it was like heartbreaking to me, of course I wanted the position. I invested a lot of time into it.
Right.
I also understood that like a small company, they ended up like deciding it would be better for them to pick someone with a little bit more experience than me. Mm, so that was like months ago, and I totally respect their decision.
Right.
And
Right.
that's just one. Yeah, that's one example of sort of the interviews I've sort of done.
Gotcha. Yep. Thanks for sharing that. And yeah, and so what are your thoughts on the process of like writing like a whole big old data structures and algorithms as opposed to asking you iOS specific questions? Uh,
Yeah,
yeah, what are the pros and cons of that? Yes.
yeah, it's a interesting topic. Um, I don't know how much, doing big O notation type problems really tells you about how good someone's going to be as an iOS developer.
Mm,
Um, because like most of the algorithms, like you're not going to implement them yourself. Like you're not going to like just randomly implement binary search by yourself, probably. You know what I mean?
right,
Um, and if you were to implement one of these algorithms, it's just not natural the way you do it in the interview setting. You would go Google the algorithm, you know what I mean? Like you don't just like, let me do Dijkstra's algorithm or something from like memory or something, you know what I mean? That's not something you do.
right,
Um, um, at the same time, I know it's really hard for like, someone to measure how good you are at something.
right,
And so my opinion on it is that it's not it's very imperfect, but you as someone who is interviewing for jobs, you have to go study it. You know what I mean? And I think it does make you better in some ways. I don't know.
right.
Mixed feelings on it.
That's fine. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, for me, I just think like I wish they would focus more on iOS questions just to try to see how you are, your iOS knowledge. But yeah, we'll see how going forward, hopefully that will be better in the future,
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you.
for sure. And yeah, so where do you see yourself in like 3 to 5 years from now?
Where I would want to be, I've put a lot of thought into that. I see myself like in the first real iOS development job that I get. mm, I really want to spend like 2 3 years like growing even more as a developer, because I feel like I've grown like an amazing amount like in that year and a half journey. But like I know how I would do a lot of things, but how would a larger company do these same things? You know what I mean?
Right.
How do you deal with stuff like mm, like the type of merge problems you have when you have a large team like merging code together? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Merge conflicts that like I won't get as a single person.
Right. Right. Yeah. Collaborating with like designers and working with like product manager and all that. So it's a whole different dynamic and having like a process of like from design to actual development and then to production. So it's a whole learning process. Yeah, hopefully you do
So
get a good opportunity like that. Sure.
yeah, and so I'd want to spend that 3 years learning, and then after that, I would love at some point to try to do the indie thing eventually afterwards, but it's
Nice.
down the road.
Yeah. So what is the difference between collection views and table views?
I would say the main difference is collection views have orthogonal scrolling. You can scroll left to right. Table views are up and down, typically the
Yeah.
cells.
Yep. And also like collection views are more flexible, would you say?
Yeah, no, I always think of
Hmm.
I don't use a lot of collection views, but I always think of like the music app or something like that, where can
Yes.
you lay out like a lot of
Right.
yeah. You
Nice.
know.
And what's your personal preference?
I typically go for table views. I haven't found I often I I usually don't need orthogonal scrolling.
Right.
Um, but that's me.
Nice. All right. Um, what is the application life cycle?
Yeah, it's the application lifecycle is your app coming into being and a bunch of there's a there's a number of methods that are called by your
Yeah.
UI application object that sort of
Yes.
mm, manage that life cycle and inform you about when is your app about is coming into being, when is it in being, and when is it going out of being.
That's
Um,
right. Yeah.
I, I, I'm hoping you're not going to ask me to name all the methods by memory.
Oh no. No, man. Yeah. But they're located in like the app delegate. You see it?
Yeah, pre iOS 13, and then now the new ones they got scene delegate, so
So,
they
that's
moved
right.
a lot of that stuff there.
Nice. Yep. And what are closures and how are they used?
Uh, Closures are they're a reference type one. They're basically a function because you have a block of code that can take parameters, they can return a value. They don't have to return a value. They don't have to take parameters, just like functions would. Um, but you get some special syntax with it, like trailing closure syntax. So,
Right.
you can often, if your last parameter is a closure in a function, you can break it out of the parentheses and use trailing closure syntax there. Um, plus, plus you also have a capture list with closures because it's a reference type. You have to be worried about retain cycles.
Gotcha.
So so you got that little capture list before your parentheses for the parameters.
Nice. Yeah. Pretty good explanations. Mhm. And yeah, how do you make a pixel perfect UI according to a designer's specs?
Oh wow, that's a good question. How do I make pixel perfect UI? Um, I guess like so I use auto layout, but like a lot of people say if you really want pixel perfect, you know what I mean, you really need to use, you know, make your own frames and design some of your views that way. Um, the, it's so now you hear, yeah, and auto layout. There's a performance cost to auto layout too, which you also have to consider. Um, but yeah, I'm not sure pixel perfect.
So
I've been, yeah.
do you like, would you prefer to do it like a storyboard or programmatically?
Personally, I prefer programmatically. I don't mind storyboards, and
Mhm.
a lot of companies, including one of the companies I just interviewed with, they use storyboards, and so I'm perfectly good with it. But like, mm, maybe it's the part of me that like I always like to do things from the command line rather than like use the mouse and
Right, right.
uh, or just
Yeah, I'm along the same lines as well. I like to have everything in one place in code as opposed to like going back and forth. So
yeah, me too. And using the weird IB outlet thing, and
right,
it's just yeah, it's cleaner to me.
yeah, yeah,
The main, I suppose, would be you would have to say it's type safety, right? Like
yes,
thing that it's the thing that makes it mm, different than Objective C or different than a lot of languages, different than Python and JavaScript. Or,
Mhm.
um, but and so like I guess the advantage to having that static type system is that
Mhm.
you because of the way you're forced to write code and always be aware of what type are you dealing with, you know what I mean?
Right,
You're less likely to run into the sort of programming problems that you'll end up with if you
yeah,
don't get those sort of checks from the compiler documentation.
right,
And I like the syntax too, and it's become even more simple. Like when you look at like Swift UI syntax, like
right,
there's a lot going on in Swift UI. It omits the return word. You
hmm
don't realize like when you're like that hello world
right,
thing. It's if you're returning. if you were to make an H stack of
Right.
it's like it's a tuple of like text structs. You know what I mean? It's
Right.
just you don't see that because of the opaque return type. You know what I mean? It's elegant.
Right. Nice. And all right, next question. What is a code coverage?
Code coverage. So like for unit testing and stuff like that.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've I've interviewed at a number of companies now. Different companies seem to have different metrics for like what is good code coverage.
Right.
Um, the number I've heard a lot is like a lot of the companies are aiming for 90% code coverage.
Mhm.
Um, it's I think it's pretty difficult to get 100%, but it's basically how many different parts of your code have you written unit tests for,
Yeah.
um, and yeah, it's that more is better, obviously,
Right.
and I guess how you write your code, you know, switch, separating things out cleanly out of your view controllers makes getting higher, covering more of the app via unit testing easier
Right.
than if it were all together. What are the challenges of working with UI and iOS? Um, you have a lot of different screen sizes, and sometimes if you start with like a large phone like a iPhone Pro Max 11 Max,
Mhm.
then when you go to run that same code on like let's say an SE,
Yeah.
mm, those rounded corners that might have looked nice on the large phone don't necessarily look nice on a very small phone. And that's the big challenge. There's a lot of different screen sizes.
That's it. And hopefully, like things with like Swift UI, it kind of helps that challenge of like dealing with different screen sizes.
No, I think so too. It does so many different things for you,
Mhm.
and, and it does it very well,
What
surprisingly.
is MVC?
MVC is probably the most common design pattern in iOS apps. It's something that, yeah, um, it's a bit, so it's model view controller is what the acronym stands for,
Yeah.
and the ideal is you have you have your view, you have a controller, and you have your model, and the
Yeah.
controller kind of sits between your model and your control, your model and your view, and
Right.
your model and your view aren't aware of each other. So like
Right.
the user taps on that button in the view,
Yeah.
um, that information gets sent that it was tapped, goes to the controller, and then the controller decides what do I need back from the model, and then it gets that information back from the model, and then the controller decides what do I do next in the view. So like it's a way of decoupling the view
Right.
and your model from each other.
Right. And you also you mentioned the MVVM earlier.
Hmm.
And what would be the advantage of that over MVC?
So you there's one, so like a lot of stuff, a lot of logic can go into your model.
Mhm.
Um, with all these design patterns, there seems to be like, okay, what now I'm no longer dumping code in my controller, but now I'm moving it somewhere else.
Yeah.
And I think with MVVM, it's kind you have the additional component of the view model, and so with a view model, you get to, rather than just directly from model to controller to view, you now have this thing that formats what you get back from the model to make it ready to be something that you're going to display. Um, for instance, getting like, turning stuff into buttons that'll be in your view, or cells that'll be in your view, or formatting the data how you want it to be. And
Right.
I guess one of the big advantages there is like you're not you're not messing with your model as much. You're doing that kind of work within your view model
Right.
rather than sort of
Right.
yeah.
And that way it makes it easier for you to like test it.
Oh, for sure, is like
Right.
keeping that stuff even more separated.
Right.
It's just one more level of abstraction. It does help with testing.
Yeah. All right.
Protocol is something that it's basically what methods and properties does a class or struct conforming to this protocol need, to be considered, you know, be, be what properties and methods do you need to implement to conform to a certain protocol, and how is it used? It's used a lot. It's used like the delegation pattern, which is the delegate pattern, which is like fundamental communication pattern. You say your delegate is going to handle, I don't know, give me an example, like some particular method, you know what I mean?
Right.
Um,
But you have your UI table view delegates.
yeah, like your UI table view data source and UI table
Yeah.
view, yeah, and
Yeah.
yeah, that's a protocol. So those conform to certain protocols, and because they conform to certain protocols, there are certain methods you have to implement in those like delegates. Yeah, so one's a constant and one's a variable. So like one you can, if it's a constant, it's just something that you can read from, basically. You're not going to write to that place. And if it's a var, you can both read and write to that, you know, address in memory, I guess.
Nice. And yep, that's it.
Very cool.
Yeah. And yeah, just to close it off, I just want to say, what advice would you have for somebody like Tristan getting started, someone like you just getting started for the very first time in iOS development? What advice would you have for a person like that?
I would say build stuff and build stuff early. You start with those tutorials, of course, like those Ray Wonderlick tutorials. But even if you're just doing a tutorial, change something on it. Like early on, you know what I mean? Just like, okay, I'm going to change the background color. I'm going to add an extra button. And a lot of things won't make sense at first. But if you just keep building something, especially once you start building your own thing, you're going to learn a lot of things very quickly. And so that's my main advice: build and build early.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't want to go into like a tutorial rabbit hole.
Yeah,
So,
it's easy to get trapped there, but like I feel like if you're always changing something, even if it's just a tutorial, you know what I mean? And
right.
realize like when you're doing a tutorial, like you just learned you just got a new tool in your belt. If it was a tutorial on URL session, well, now you know how to make GET requests, you know what I mean? If it's a tutorial on, some UI element, now you know how to do, like, I don't know, animations, you know what I mean? Like
So,
you now have a new tool, and you keep adding these tools, you'll be able to make your own thing.
sure. Thanks. All right, Tristan. That was great. And wishing you all the best. And, stay in contact for sure. Never know
Yeah,
how.
thank you so much. It was I'm happy we did this.